They read the inheritance behind closed doors and carved me out like I never existed. I knew something was wrong the moment the lawyer avoided my eyes. My name wasn't mentioned once, not even as an afterthought, not even a gesture of token remembrance. It was as if I had never belonged, never bled the same grief, never spent cold nights in hospital waiting rooms with them, waiting on the same man to die. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I only sat there and let the silence wrap around me like armor. The rest of them, my father's second wife, her children, the cousins who only showed up for birthdays and barbecues, shared glances, awkward smiles, carefully measured guilt. But not one of them said my name. A week later, a message arrived from my stepmother. Just one line: "You're not family." No greeting. No explanation. Not even an ounce of decency. It should have broken something in me. Maybe it did, but not in the way she expected. I didn't rage. I didn't beg. I didn't even reply. Instead, I stared at the words until the screen dimmed, and by then, the coldness in me had settled deep. I wasn't erased. I was disrespected. And disrespect has a way of blooming into something far more dangerous when you feed it time, silence, and a long memory. I started watching them, quietly, the way a hunter watches from cover, never moving, too fast, never making a sound. At brunches, their laughs sounded too loud. At memorial gatherings, their eyes were too dry. I watched them sip from my father's antique glasses and pass off stories as if they had known him best. Their kindness felt off, too polished, like they had practiced it. And slowly, I started to see the cracks, small but telling. A flinch when I brought up his will, a change in tone when someone mentioned the lake house. Faces I once trusted twisted just slightly out of place when they thought I wasn't looking. I played the part for a little while longer, keeping close but quiet. Then, one night, I went back to the old study, the one they said had been cleared out. It hadn't. Not really. Behind the loose panel in the desk, one I remembered from childhood hide and seek were letters, receipts, copies of property transfers, notes in my father's own hand. There were questions in those documents, suspicions scribbled in margins. It seemed even he didn't trust them in the end. And suddenly, I had something more than rage. I had direction. From that moment on, I started digging not in anger, but with purpose. I retraced every step my father had taken before he passed. I spoke to his old attorney in secret. I visited the notary who remembered his frustration at the last revision meeting. I found the gardener who'd been abruptly fired and the nurse who had heard arguments through thin walls. They thought I had walked away. They thought silence meant surrender. But I was already deep in the bloodline of their buried truths. One by one, the pieces began to surface. A trust rewritten but never filed. A land deed mysteriously lost from county records. A set of photos of my father at the bank, dated after the will they presented. There was even a document signed in his name, but the signature didn't match. It was close, but not close enough for someone who'd watched that signature curl over birthday cards and report cards for decades. My evidence was mounting, and I hadn't even started speaking. Their arrogance grew as quickly as their mistakes. One cousin took a new car loan under my father's estate as collateral. A sibling posted a celebratory vacation photo from the lake house, now technically in their name. They thought they'd won, that their forged kingdom would last. But they didn't notice the bank alert I triggered, the questions I quietly fed into the auditor's hands, or the anonymous packet I slipped into the hands of a nosy financial reporter who specialized in legacy fraud. I smiled through it all, toasted their new beginnings, wore the same black dress to every charity gala, never missed a holiday, never raised suspicion. I was the model of grace, the perfect forgotten daughter. They never saw it coming. The storm wasn't loud. It wasn't messy. It built quietly, cell by cell, and I carried it beneath my calm exterior like a blade tucked into silk. All I needed was the final tug, the trigger. So I reached out to the right people. A lawyer who owed my father, a reporter who remembered his community work, an estranged executor from an older draft of the will, the one they never knew existed. The truth was never hidden. It was simply waiting in the open, camouflaged by their greed. I gave it breath, I let it live again, and then I stepped back, just far enough to watch it all begin to crumble. It started small. One cousin froze their accounts. A lawyer called to say the trust's validity was under review. The executor reappeared, questioning property transfers and notarized statements. A sibling panicked and tried to sell their inheritance quickly. The stepmother rattled, called me at 2:06 a.m. Her voice was shaky. "We need to talk." I didn't pick up. There was nothing left to say. The courtroom was cold, public, official, just the way I wanted it. I walked in with folders I never once opened during the proceedings. They already knew what was in them. Evidence, signatures, dates, contradictions. A timeline that made their lies impossible to defend. And one letter, my father's last, handwritten note to me, sealed and dated after their so-called final will. That was the final blow. The judge didn't need more than 10 minutes to decide. They didn't scream. They didn't fight. That would have been easier to witness. Instead, I watched the realization slowly, painfully dawn on them. One by one, their faces broke not with fury, but with disbelief. The kind that only comes when you realize you were never as clever as you thought. Their empire fell not with fire, but with quiet signatures and legal reversals. No drama, no spectacle, just the slow, devastating loss of everything they built on stolen ground. I watched them fall. Quietly, from across the room, I saw my stepmother's hands tremble as her accounts were frozen. My cousin, jobless, now lowered his head. The sibling, who once called me irrelevant, didn't speak a word as the judge read the verdict. They didn't see justice as fire and fury, but I did. I saw it in every revoked deed, every reversed document, every piece of wealth clawed back into the truth's cold hands. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I simply nodded and walked away. In the end, I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to threaten. I just let the truth exist where they thought it had been buried. I never raised my voice. I never touched a thing. I just let the facts speak louder than their legacy. And when I walked out, I didn't take revenge. I took everything they tried to steal, and I left them with a silence they'll never forget. Raised on the fringes of privilege, I learned early what silence could earn me. The marble walls of the estate echoed with laughter that never quite reached me, stories that paused when I entered the room, and glances that dismissed me with polished ease. I wore the clothes, attended the parties, and sat through dinners where my name was forgotten before dessert. To the outside world, I was one of them, another product of wealth and lineage. But I knew the truth. I had always known. I wasn't born into that world. I was allowed in just enough to watch it all from the edge. Just enough to be useful. Their games were old, sophisticated, quiet betrayals dressed as traditions. But I played along. I watched. I listened. Because knowing the rules meant knowing when to break them. When the patriarch, the only person who ever treated me as more than decoration, began to fade, the estate turned cold. Not from grief, but anticipation. I noticed the closed doors, the meetings and backrooms, the nods exchanged in hushed corners. There were whispers about his health, then whispers about his mind, and eventually, there were whispers about the will. But I wasn't called into those rooms. They spoke of legacy like it was something you could steal with a signature. He had once ruled everything with unspoken control, the kind that didn't need raised voices to instill fear. But in those last days, someone got close enough to poison his peace, if not his body, then his beliefs. They turned him inward, made him question loyalties, twisted facts until he saw shadows where there had only been trust. And when he finally slipped away, the game resumed with a new leader, the one who had smiled the hardest at the funeral. He wept in public, gave speeches about honor and duty, but when the curtains fell, his eyes were dry and his smirk was back. He acted like it was his coronation, and in many ways, it was. The grieving heir, standing above the rest, basking in applause he orchestrated himself. That was the moment I knew. It wasn't grief he wore. It was victory. A rigged game, now sealed in legal ink. To them, I was almost one of them. Almost enough to be useful. Never enough to be family. I was invited to the table but never given a steak. When the family gathered, I was handed the camera, never the toast, and I accepted it. For a long time, I let them believe I'd accepted it, because the longer they thought I was harmless, the deeper I could sink my roots into what they tried to bury. The old man had confided in me during his final months, not out of pity but out of truth. Late at night, with the estate asleep and the oxygen machine hissing gently beside us, he told stories no one else heard. About land he never trusted anyone to claim. About documents he hadn't finished signing. About betrayals he feared but couldn't name. I remembered every word, and I kept quiet, because truth, I learned, is heavier than any wool and twice as sharp. But when I tried to return to the study after the funeral, the door was locked. My key no longer worked. The caretaker who once greeted me with warmth acted like he barely recognized me. And the papers, the notes, the recordings, vanished, gone like smoke. It wasn't grief that stole them. It was calculation. They had scrubbed away every trace of my claim, every piece of him that lived in me. Still, I said nothing. Even when he leaned in during the will reading, just inches from my ear, and whispered, "You were never one of us," he said it like a curse, like a dare. But he didn't know what that sentence unlocked. It didn't shatter me. It clarified me. I didn't want to be one of them. I wanted to be the one who undid them. They mistook my silence for defeat, but they had no idea how sharp silence could be when wielded by someone who'd spent a lifetime learning the language of absence. I remembered every whispered story, every nod, every secret glance I wasn't supposed to catch. They erased my name from paper, but not from memory, and memory was all I needed to bring them down. Not with rage, not with scandal, but with precision. And that was the promise I made to the man who raised me in shadows, who trusted me with the truth. They buried him with lies in their mouths and greed in their hearts. But I would make sure his stories didn't stay buried. I would turn every secret he shared into a weapon. And I wouldn't shout when it was done. I would walk away the same way I arrived, quiet, uninvited, underestimated. But this time, I wouldn't leave empty-handed. I didn't scream. I didn't storm into rooms demanding answers. I simply watched. They thought the game was over, that they had won. While they drank champagne and smiled for cameras, I stood in the back, quiet, polite, forgettable. Every nod I gave, every smile I returned, was a lie wrapped in velvet. They saw me as someone left behind, someone defeated, but I was never out. I was in the shadows, listening when they laughed aloud, noticing the slips in their stories, the details they contradicted when they thought no one was keeping track. They buried the truth sloppily, arrogant enough to believe no one would dig, but I did. I started with the old emails, ones they thought deleted, but which had lived in my father's offline backups. I found fragments of drafts, legal language never finalized, notes that hinted at hesitations. Then came the half-burned papers in the study's fireplace, edges charred, but dates still legible. They tried to erase him before he had even been buried, but they didn't finish the job. The truth was scattered, fragmented, and almost lost. Almost each piece unearthed came with a memory, smiles that now felt rehearsed, toasts at dinners that I now knew were meant to distract. Every moment they called me family, every pat on the back, now played in my mind like evidence. They had welcomed me only so long as I served a purpose. Now I was just inconvenient, disposable, but I remembered it all. Their words weren't just insults, they were threads, and I was pulling each one until the whole web began to tremble. The real break came when I found the file hidden in the cloud drive linked to an old account. A set of unsigned documents dated 3 weeks before my father passed, ones that contradicted the final will. The signatures didn't match, not just in style but in timing. The ink had supposedly dried on the new will after he had already lost the ability to sign anything coherent. There were pages missing, updates never recorded, notes redacted by someone who clearly knew what they were doing, but not well enough. So I found others, not the people they respected, but the ones they overlooked. The old lawyer my father had trusted for years quietly dismissed weeks before the final will was filed. The housekeeper who had once been silenced with a severance check and an NDA, but still kept a diary, and the nurse quiet, gentle, always watching, who remembered who visited during the last few nights and who left the room laughing. Piece by piece, the story took shape, and every person they dismissed gave me another piece of power. He, especially, had grown bold. In interviews, he praised my father's vision, quoted him out of context, claimed he had been chosen because he understood the legacy. He wore tailored suits and spoke with rehearsed grief, as if pretending long enough made it real. I let him speak. I let him mock. I let him shine. Because while he soaked in attention, I built my case. Every lie he told publicly became leverage. Privately, then the final nail arrived in a quiet envelope from the investigator I had hired in secret. One audio file, no video, just a voice, his voice smooth, rehearsed, coaxing my father into rethinking his beneficiaries. You want to keep things simple, don't you? No confusion, just trust me. That voice, calm and collected, sounded nothing like grief. It was control, exploitation, manipulation. And now it was mine. What I'd been handed wasn't just evidence. It was motive. He had robbed me of inheritance. Yes, but more than that, he had tried to erase the relationship between a father and daughter. He had turned final moments into business deals. He hadn't just taken money. He had taken dignity, memory, the right to mourn without being stripped of identity. And in doing so, he gave me something he didn't understand. He gave me purpose. Not to hurt him, but to make sure he could never pretend again, because you can fight over money. You can rewrite papers. You can bribe silence. But once truth is recorded, once motive is revealed, it doesn't just speak. It screams. And I was done whispering. He always believed he was the smartest man in the room. That arrogance blinded him. When he tried to broker a deal with the development rights that didn't belong to him, rights my father had reserved under a separate holding, he didn't realize he'd stepped into territory protected by contracts older than our feud. He signed papers without reading, too hungry for applause. I watched quietly as he handed over power in exchange for praise, not knowing those papers stripped him of the very protections he thought were untouchable. What he thought was just another deal was bait, dressed in polished language and praise. The clause buried in page 17 looked harmless, a small adjustment to asset permissions, but it revoked his authority over the land, reverting ownership to the estate, my estate, upon breach of fiduciary duty. His signature made it legal. His greed made it inevitable. I didn't need to twist the knife. He drove it in himself. At the gala, dressed in smug satisfaction, he gave a speech about honoring legacy. I stood nearby, smiling politely, raising my glass to toast his empty words. I thanked him graciously, even as the paperwork proof of his overreach, his fraud, was already in the hands of my lawyer. He clinked his glass against mine, thinking he had won. All I saw was a man standing at the edge of a cliff, waving to the crowd as the ground crumbled beneath him. That night, an encrypted file arrived in the inbox of a small but credible journalist, an unsigned tip with attachments too precise to ignore. By morning, whispers of fraud, embezzlement, and betrayal flooded financial blogs and legal forums. His name trended for the wrong reasons. By noon, news anchors spoke his name with clipped tones and raised eyebrows. His silence said everything. He didn't know where it came from. He didn't know it had only just begun. The journalist's questions opened old wounds. A creditor from a buried lawsuit, a debt he thought paid and forgotten, emerged with records, receipts, and a fury sharpened by years of silence. He demanded repayment, but what he really exposed was worse. The books, the discrepancies, the personal accounts entangled with company funds. It wasn't just money missing, it was trust. Shattered in decimal points and misfiled tax reports, investors didn't wait. They never do. One by one, they vanished. A few made statements. Most just disappeared. Meetings were cancelled. Endorsements revoked. The smooth charm he once wore like armor started to crack. He looked thinner. His smiles lasted seconds instead of minutes. And still, he didn't see me. Still, he thought the enemy was somewhere in the shadows, not sitting across from him at board meetings with a quiet nod and an unreadable expression. He started pointing fingers, first at his assistants, then at the media, then at the very people who once praised him, but never at me. I was still the quiet one, still the niece, still grieving. He looked for saboteurs with bold voices and sharp tongues, not the calm presence who asked soft questions and always left the room early. He never suspected the silence. That was his final mistake, and when everything else had collapsed, when the calls stopped, when the threats turned inward, I met him in the office my father once occupied. He looked at me tired, frantic, and finally uncertain. I let the silence stretch between us. Then I said it softly, with no venom, no joy, just truth. You should have made sure I had nothing to lose. His face changed, not with fear, with recognition, as if, for the first time, he saw what had always been there, someone who had been quiet long enough, someone who remembered every slight, every theft, every lie told beneath the mask of family. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence was the confession. He never noticed the silence tightening around him. That was the beauty of it. Every word he'd twisted, every paper he'd altered, every lie he'd dressed in charm, I'd catalogued it all. While he stood in rooms full of applause, I stood in shadows stitching threads together. One by one, the pieces shifted into place. A misfiled transfer here, an altered timestamp there. The web tightened slowly, and he walked straight into its center, too proud to imagine the noose. By the time he noticed the tension, it was far too late to slip free. The room was packed when the documents were unsealed. I didn't say much. I didn't have to. The evidence spoke louder than outrage ever could. His signature on accounts that didn't exist, duplicates of contracts that vanished mid-audit, one forged deed, two falsified reports, three unnamed accounts in offshore holdings. I let him build the illusion of power for years, and now I dismantled it with a quiet press of a button and a nod to my lawyer. No performance, no rage, just the truth, unvarnished and irreversible. Then came the voices they always ignored. The maid who remembered when he sent her out of the room during a family will reading. The junior partner who found a second draft of a contract in the trash, one that looked nothing like the one filed. Even the dead had something to say. My father's final recorded message, unreleased until today, naming the true heir and warning of a snake behind a polished smile. Every voice was a key, and together they unlocked a truth too large to bury. He tried to laugh when the press approached, still clinging to that easy charm, but the laugh cracked on the second breath. His eyes darted as questions flew, but this time there were no scripts. Just legal papers, flashing cameras, and a silence from his allies that screamed louder than the accusations. I stood nearby, watching, not gloating, just ensuring there were no exits left unguarded. His supporters began to whisper, then to call their lawyers. Donations were rescinded. Family members returned gifts and distanced themselves with rehearsed apologies and shaking hands. No one wanted to burn with him. He wasn't a legacy anymore. He was a liability. I watched his name fall from invitations, from bios, from plaques on walls built with money that now carried the stink of exposure. The internet, hungry as ever, smelled blood and pounced. Screens lit up with hashtags, screenshots, timelines of every deed he'd buried, conspiracies and facts tangled, but the truth remained untouched and brutal. His fall became a trending story, his face a meme for betrayal. He couldn't outrun it, couldn't spin it, couldn't sleep through it. By the time he reached for damage control, the damage was done. I didn't need a headline. I didn't need to raise my voice. I simply watched, calm, as the world saw the man I'd always known him to be. He looked for a savior, maybe expected me to intervene, to rescue him out of some twisted loyalty. But I sat in the front row, unblinking. The storm howled around him. I never moved, because justice doesn't need volume, it just needs patience. When it finally broke him, it wasn't the money, or the scandal, or the isolation. It was the silence. The knowledge that his game was over and I'd never even raised my voice. That everything he thought was his, every name, every title, every ounce of legacy had slipped through his fingers into mine. And then, the scream. The only sound he had left. This was supposed to be mine. I met his eyes, steady and clear. My voice was low. Final, you were never family either. And just like that, it was over. He once ruled rooms with a smile that felt like sunlight, confident, composed, untouchable. Now, his name is read aloud in a courtroom with the weight of felony charges attached, frozen accounts, seized property, and a list of legal infractions so long it had to be delivered in parts. The crowd that once stood to clap now leans in for gossip. I sit in the back, hands folded, not out of modesty, but because my work is done. He doesn't look back at me, he knows. The fall was loud, public, and best of all, permanent. The wealth he built on falsified trust and stolen legacy didn't vanish, it changed hands. And I, the girl he once dismissed in every boardroom, now control the fortune he clawed together. But I don't hoard it. I redirect it toward scholarships in my mother's name, toward restoring the housing my father once dreamed of building before illness silenced him. I refuse to let what he poisoned become my crown. I clean the blood off it, reshape it, and place it quietly where it belongs, not on my head, but in service of something better. People ask questions, press, family, strangers who once called him brilliant, but I answer none of them. I don't need to. The court filings are public. The truth doesn't need to shout when it's written in black ink on every document he signed while thinking no one was watching. The silence I hold isn't fear or pride, it's control. I let the whispers grow. Let them argue over how it happened. Let them wonder how the girl they ignored became the storm he never saw coming. He walks through court buildings now like a ghost of himself. The sharp suits replaced with plain fabric and worry. The same people who once followed his lead now avoid eye contact in hallways. His invitations stopped coming. His name wiped from plaques. Exiled, not by decree, but by disinterest. Even his apologies ring hollow, landing on no ears. The world moves on. Without him, around him, in spite of him. That is his sentence. And me? I don't need revenge parties or luxury broadcasts. I don't post photos or give interviews. My life is elegant, deliberate, and free. No drama, no noise, just the satisfaction of a quiet breakfast in a home I own, surrounded by the peace that only justice can buy. I wear nothing flashy, but everything I carry is real, mine, earned, untouched by their lies, uncorrupted by their need for validation. He sees it too, sometimes from headlines, sometimes from the window of a halfway house that replaced his mansion. He sees the organizations I've built, the speeches I give when I choose to. He sees the face of someone who never needed his approval and now stands where he once claimed no one else could. He can't stop it, can't undo it, and worst of all, he can't look away. They called me a nobody, insignificant, a mistake of bloodline and timing. But I learned something in the silence they forced me into. Power doesn't come from being invited. It comes from being underestimated, and I was, until I wasn't.